Estamos prácticamente en Navidad, como habéis visto, después de las luces, así que buenos días a todos. Un día estupendo que tenemos aquí en Madrid. Muchas gracias por venir a esta presentación del World Energy Outlook, que es la 16. Llevamos 16 años presentando este World Energy Outlook, ¿no? Está con nosotros Thomas Spencer, que va a presentar. Thank you, Thomas, for coming here to introduce and to present this report. And Lucía, muchas gracias por venir desde el Ministerio, a su directora junta, y muchas gracias, consejeros, a todo el mundo y a todos los amigos que estáis aquí, ¿no? Yo creo que esta es una presentación, quizá ahora la agencia, yo creo que este era el flagship, ¿no? Era el libro rojo que teníamos de seguimiento. Ahora la agencia ha hecho muchísimos más informes, como sabéis. Yo en propio septiembre tenía el Net Zero como nuevo informe, también ligados a la COP28, ha presentado informes parciales de diversas áreas que nosotros estamos haciendo, y este quizá, digamos, es comprensivo respecto a todo el conjunto de esos. Por tanto, seguidos, yo creo que el miércoles que viene presenta nuevamente Tomás el de eficiencia energética. Es decir, yo creo que la agencia se ha convertido también en un prescriptor, ¿no?, en el mundo de los informes y el mundo del energético en general. Así que vamos a darle la palabra, antes de que empiece, a Lucía ahora mismo, y yo creo que os recomiendo que lo podáis descargar, ¿no? Yo creo que es free, yo creo que tiene cosas muy positivas, viendo especialmente el incremento de la inversión entre las renovables y también un poco el gran avance tecnológico, ¿no? Y antes de darle la palabra a Lucía, voy a presentaros también a Thomas Spencer. Thomas Spencer, he's a modeler here he works with Laura Cosi. He came here in September. He was there in the introduction, the presentation of the Zero report, and now he worked before in IDRI and in several institutions of that, and he joined the EIA in 2021. No? 2021 it was the Thank you for coming, and wait a moment there. I'm going to give the floor first a the Minister, a Lucía Blanco, su directora general adjunta de prospectiva y regulación y una serie de cosas, ¿no? O sea, Lucía.
Bueno, buenos días. Bueno, en primer lugar, agradecer al Club Español de la Energía la invitación. Es un placer para mí verdaderamente estar aquí representando al Ministerio para Transición Ecológica y el Reto Demográfico en la presentación del WEO 2023. Estamos en un momento crucial de la historia donde, bueno, la transición hacia fuentes de energía más sostenibles y respetuosas con el medio ambiente se ha convertido en una necesidad y prioridad global. Y en este contexto, este informe que nos convoca hoy aquí adquiere una relevancia excepcional. Es evidente que el cambio climático es una amenaza cierta y enorme para el planeta, y si bien las políticas de mitigación se han expandido considerablemente en esta última década, el sexto informe de evaluación del IPCC, que, bueno, como conocéis, es el informe que nos actualiza el conocimiento disponible en materia de cambio climático, advierte de que la aplicación de las políticas de mitigación anunciadas en la COP25 en 2020 nos lleva a escenarios en el que el incremento de la temperatura global se situaría en este siglo ya en 3,2 grados por encima de niveles preindustriales. Bueno, no tengo que recordar el 1,5 grados de objetivo de París. Este informe concluye también que el refuerzo de estas medidas que se llevó a cabo antes de la COP26 a lo largo del año 2021 aún nos conduce a escenarios que suponen que en este siglo rebasamos el 1,5 grados e incluso plantean dificultad para mantenernos por debajo de los 2 grados, que es el máximo del Acuerdo de París. De hecho, también concluye que si las políticas no mantienen su ambición más allá del año 2030, podríamos estar alcanzando escenarios de aumento de 2,8 grados antes del final del siglo. Bien, ante este reto, este año va a tener lugar la COP28, que es una cumbre crucial y que se espera que sea la más importante desde el Acuerdo de París, y supone una oportunidad única para abordar los desafíos climáticos y avanzar hacia soluciones concretas. Recientemente, en la Cumbre de Energía y Clima, celebrada aquí en Madrid el 2 de octubre, se acordaron ya objetivos de cara a la COP28, como son triplicar la potencia renovable o doblar las mejoras en eficiencia energética de aquí a 2030. En esta COP28 se va a llevar a cabo el primer balance global, para el que ya contamos con un informe de síntesis de Naciones Unidas que nos orienta y pone el foco en reforzar la respuesta en todos los sectores y contextos para abordar la necesidad apremiante de cerrar la brecha de emisiones y alcanzar el objetivo del 1,5 grados. El informe reconoce también la urgencia de eliminar progresivamente los combustibles fósiles, y esto incluye, evidentemente, aumentar el despliegue de renovables, avanzar en electrificación, promover la eficiencia energética, desarrollar capacidades de almacenamiento energético y mejorar la gestión de la demanda. En este sentido, el Net Zero Roadmap de la Agencia Internacional de la Energía señala que con las tecnologías disponibles a día de hoy, eficiencia energética, despliegue de renovables, reducción de emisiones de metano directas del sector energético y aumento de la electrificación, podríamos alcanzar un 80% de la reducción de emisiones necesaria de aquí a 2030. Por tanto, tenemos las herramientas necesarias para avanzar mucho más rápido. Este despliegue tecnológico va a traer consigo, además, importantes oportunidades en términos de empleo. Ha salido recientemente también el World Energy Employment 2023, que concluye también que la revolución de energías renovables está generando millones de oportunidades laborales en todo el mundo, con más de la mitad de estas oportunidades concentradas en sectores como la eólica, la fotovoltaica, la movilidad eléctrica, las baterías, las bombas de calor y los materiales críticos. Tenemos que aprovechar adecuadamente estas oportunidades y para ello, y así concluye también este informe, va a ser necesario reforzar la capacitación y las capacidades humanas en tecnologías limpias. La emergencia climática pone ante nosotros un gran reto en el que, sin embargo, estamos dando pasos firmes y constantes hacia la neutralidad climática y cada año estamos dando avances notorios. Aquí en España, por ejemplo, según datos de Red Eléctrica muy recientes, el pasado 17 de noviembre ya superamos la producción de energía eléctrica renovable de todo el año 2022, que ese año supuso un 42% del total de la producción. Hasta el 20 de noviembre, la producción renovable creció un 14% respecto al mismo periodo del año anterior. Y además, el 3 de noviembre de este año se ha registrado el máximo de participación del conjunto de las renovables sobre el total del mix, con una cuota del 73,3%. En 2023 se han dado importantes pasos también en materia de transición energética y voy a citar un hito muy importante en este sentido, que ha sido la presentación de los borradores de los Planes Nacionales Integrados de Energía y Clima por parte de todos los Estados miembros de la Unión. Desde la adopción del Reglamento de Gobernanza para la Unión de la Energía y la Acción por el Clima en 2018, que unificaba por primera vez las agendas de energía y clima en una sola regulación, los Estados miembros contamos con unas herramientas integradas de planificación que nos permiten alinear nuestros objetivos con los objetivos a nivel europeo. Estas herramientas son precisamente los PNIEC y las estrategias de descarbonización a largo plazo que continúan esa senda hasta el año 2050. Entonces, digamos que estos dos instrumentos son como los planes directores de la transición energética hasta la neutralidad climática. Cumpliendo con este reglamento de gobernanza, España remitió su primer borrador de actualización, su primer borrador del PNIEC en 2020 y este plan, como conocéis todos de primera mano, está ahora en fase de actualización. El propio reglamento de gobernanza establece unos calendarios de revisión periódica de estos documentos y establece que en junio de 2023 los Estados miembros teníamos que mandar un borrador actualizado. Y pues esta labor la hemos llevado a cabo en plazo, ha sido el borrador que salió a consulta pública durante el verano y sobre el que ya estamos trabajando para tener una versión actualizada que, según este mismo calendario, hay que remitir a más tardar en junio de 2024. Entonces, quería aprovechar esta oportunidad para contar un poco qué ha marcado este proceso de actualización y qué contiene, cuáles son los principales resultados y objetivos. Desde que adoptamos el PNIEC anterior, que abarcaba la década completa, desde el año 2021, y ya inmersos en un proceso de profunda transformación del sector energético, el contexto ha cambiado considerablemente, ¿no? Y ha estado marcado por eventos como una pandemia, que ha tenido un impacto muy grave tanto en el sector energético como en la economía en general, y una guerra que ha derivado en una crisis energética y que ha puesto de manifiesto no solo que había que acelerar aún más la transición energética, sino que hay que reforzar también la autonomía estratégica y la independencia energética. Estos eventos tuvieron una firme y contundente respuesta por parte de Europa para contener sus efectos. En el caso de la pandemia, como instrumento de respuesta se lanzaron los fondos Next Generation EU, que suponían una movilización de inversiones sin precedentes y que para el caso de España suponía una inyección de 70.000 millones de transferencias directas y otros 70.000 millones en forma de préstamos, estando el 40% de estos fondos destinados directamente a transición ecológica, lo que supone una importante palanca para avanzar en transición, acelerar inversiones y aspirar a objetivos más ambiciosos. El pasado mes de octubre, de hecho, se aprobó la adenda de este plan de recuperación, que supone un refuerzo de muchas medidas de energía y clima. En particular, va a suponer una inyección adicional de fondos a lo que se refiere a autoconsumo y baterías detrás del contador, comunidades energéticas, hidrógeno verde, que es otra de las grandes apuestas de esta década, y las redes eléctricas para integrar las renovables. Se pone también mucho el foco en reforzar la cadena de valor de las tecnologías necesarias para acometer todo este proceso de transición hasta la neutralidad climática. En este sentido, la adenda precisamente pone el foco en desarrollar capacidades de fabricación, todos los componentes y equipos que van a ser necesarios y reducir la dependencia exterior en materia de tecnología e industria, aparte de energía. Otro de los factores que ha determinado en gran medida la actualización del PNIEC ha sido el aumento de la ambición climática a nivel europeo. Ya en el Pacto Verde Europeo, en 2019, se expresó la necesidad de alcanzar las emisiones netas antes de 2050 para poder mantenernos en esa senda de debajo de 1,5 grados. Este objetivo fue respaldado por el Parlamento Europeo y el Consejo de la Unión Europea y dio lugar a la adopción de la Ley Europea sobre el Clima, que convirtió la neutralidad climática de aquí a 2050 en un objetivo vinculante con rango de ley para toda la Unión Europea y todos los Estados miembros. Para lograr este objetivo, esta ley definió también un objetivo intermedio a 2030, que es la reducción del 55% de emisiones con respecto a 1990. Y para dar cumplimiento a este nuevo objetivo de reducción de emisiones, se aprobó el paquete Fit for 55, que daba lugar a un profundo y complejo proceso de revisión de todas las piezas legislativas que estaban en vigor y que definían hasta entonces los objetivos a 2030 y que impactan muy directamente sobre el sector energético. En este sentido, España además ha adoptado un papel muy protagonista impulsando esa ambición durante la presidencia del Consejo, pero también en los meses anteriores. Dentro del Fit for 55 se recogen medidas de múltiples sectores, que entre todas ellas, bueno, el propósito final es conseguir esa reducción del 55%, ¿no? Y por destacar algunas, bueno, en materia de energías renovables se acaba de aprobar hace pocos meses la nueva directiva sobre fuentes de energías renovables, que entre otros objetivos más específicos establece el objetivo de elevar la presencia de renovables en el uso final de la energía hasta un 42,5%, con una parte además aspiracional pudiendo llegar al 45%. En materia de eficiencia energética se ha aprobado también recientemente la Directiva de Eficiencia Energética, que establece que debe reducirse el consumo de energía final en un 38% con respecto a un escenario de referencia que la Comisión lanzó en el año 2007 y que supone, bueno, proyecciones sin políticas y medidas asociadas a los PNIEC. Desde donde nos coloca ese escenario de referencia en 2030 es desde donde calculamos estos objetivos de mejora. También dentro del paquete se incluyen medidas en otros sectores, algunas ya aprobadas, otras en negociación, como son un nuevo régimen de comercio de derechos de emisión, el Fondo Social para el Clima, el ajuste de carbono en frontera, medidas para descarbonizar el transporte terrestre, aéreo y marítimo o la reducción de emisiones de metano en el sector energético, entre otras, que acaba de llegar justo en esta semana a la fase de trílogos. Hemos asistido también a un cambio relevante en el contexto derivado de las perturbaciones a nivel mundial en la energía a consecuencia de la guerra en Ucrania y de las rupturas de cadena de suministro. Y esto ha hecho patente, como decía anteriormente, reforzar la autonomía estratégica. Todo esto se recogió en el plan Repower EU y también ha sido uno de los condicionantes o uno de los factores que ha impactado mucho en la actualización del PNIEC. Paralelamente, a nivel nacional, desde la Secretaría de Estado de Energía, se ha avanzado notablemente en la implementación del PNIEC anterior. En estos años se han aprobado más de 170 normas, estrategias, planes, hojas de ruta y medidas en general para avanzar y profundizar en el despliegue de medidas que se contenía en este primer PNIEC. Entre ellas destaca especialmente la Ley de Cambio Climático y Transición Energética, que convierte en vinculantes los objetivos del PNIEC anterior y eleva a rango de ley el objetivo de alcanzar la neutralidad climática antes de 2050. En definitiva, hemos asistido a un importante incremento de la ambición, fruto de un contexto donde la transición ecológica se acelera para dar respuesta a 3 premisas: cambio climático, recuperación económica y necesidad de reforzar nuestra autonomía estratégica. Todo esto, como decía, ha marcado en gran medida la actualización de nuestro PNIEC y se traduce en unos objetivos a 2030 que dan pleno cumplimiento a este paquete Fit for 55. Muchos ya los conocéis, voy a repasarlos brevemente. El principal sería el 32% de reducción de emisiones con respecto a 1990. Veníamos de un 23% de reducción en el PNIEC anterior y esto supone un 56% respecto al año 2005. Esto es importante destacarlo porque en el caso de España parece que se desdibujan los esfuerzos que esto supone, porque en los años 90, por el contexto de crecimiento económico, las emisiones continuaron creciendo y nuestro pico se alcanzó en el año 2005. Con lo cual, a pesar de establecer los objetivos referenciados a 1990, en realidad nos está suponiendo mitigar 1 de cada 2 toneladas de CO2 que se emitían en nuestro pico, que era el año 2005. Para respaldar este objetivo tendremos un mix de uso de energía final con un 48% de renovables, atribuido especialmente a la expansión de la generación eléctrica renovable, un aumento significativo del autoconsumo, despliegue de bombas de calor y implementación de medidas para la descarbonización del sector industrial, que incorporará paulatinamente una mayor cuota de renovables. Vamos a mejorar también nuestra eficiencia energética en un 44% en términos de energía final, superando ese objetivo europeo del 38% que comentaba antes y que viene impulsado por medidas como rehabilitación energética de edificios, donde nos hemos fijado un objetivo de rehabilitar más de 1.300.000 viviendas, que está siendo impulsado considerablemente por la palanca que supone el plan de recuperación, y otras medidas que van a dotar de también mayor eficiencia en el sector del transporte, como son el cambio modal o la electrificación del parque de vehículos, con un objetivo de 5,5 millones de vehículos eléctricos en 2030. También en 2030, respaldando esta electrificación, el 81% de la energía eléctrica será renovable, lo cual requiere que dotemos al sistema de mucha flexibilidad y mucho almacenamiento energético. Es otro de los grandes pilares del nuevo PNIEC. Además, en 2030 el 49% de la energía primaria procederá de fuentes autóctonas. Esto supone que vamos a mejorar nuestra independencia energética en 18 puntos en esta década y que vamos a mejorar nuestra balanza comercial en 90.700 millones de euros por combustibles fósiles que vamos a dejar de importar. Uno de los vectores clave, como decía, de la descarbonización va a ser la electrificación, respaldada por ese 81% de generación renovable, y esto supone un parque de generación creciente hasta los 214 gigas en 2030, de los cuales 160 gigas van a ser renovables. Esto implica instalar 105 gigas de energías renovables durante esta década. Como mencionaba también anteriormente, esta integración requiere además intensificar la flexibilidad y el almacenamiento, y en este sentido el nuevo PNIEC prevé disponer de 22 gigas de almacenamiento en 2030, haciendo uso de todas las tecnologías posibles, en lo que se refiere a almacenamiento tanto diario como semanal como estacional. Otras tecnologías detrás de estos objetivos: dispondremos de 62 gigas de energía eólica, incluyendo 3 gigas de eólica offshore, 76 gigas de solar fotovoltaica, incluyendo 19 gigas de autoconsumo, 11 gigas de electrolizadores para producción de hidrógeno verde, fundamentalmente para usos industriales. El hidrógeno verde, como decía también antes, adquiere una relevancia excepcional en esta década, y también en materia de biogás se prevé una producción de 20 teravatios hora en 2030. Estos objetivos, necesariamente más ambiciosos, se sustentan en una metodología de cálculo muy robusta. El borrador para actualización mantiene la base analítica que utilizábamos en el PNIEC anterior y se apoya en un modelo del sistema energético que emana precisamente de la Agencia Internacional de la Energía, que es el modelo TIMES. Y sobre este modelo, que se complementa con otros para otros sectores, se incorpora la última información disponible, los balances energéticos, que nos dan la foto del sector energético a día de hoy, desde el que construimos las proyecciones, las previsiones de crecimiento del PIB, de los precios internacionales de los combustibles y de los derechos de emisión, que condicionan también en gran medida cómo las tecnologías fósiles entrarían en el mix en los próximos años. Se han actualizado las hipótesis de acuerdo a los últimos avances normativos que comentaba, y se han mejorado las interrelaciones entre los distintos modelos que utilizamos. Para lograr los objetivos recogidos en el PNIEC, hemos ampliado y reforzado las medidas que teníamos en el PNIEC anterior, pasando de 78 medidas a un total de 107 en este PNIEC actualizado. Hemos realizado también un análisis de impacto de lo que supone aplicar estas medidas en términos sociales, económicos, de salud y redistributivos, y se concluye que se van a movilizar 294.000 millones de euros, el 85% de los cuales va a ser inversión privada y el 15% adicional va a ser inversión pública, y que va a ir destinado principalmente a renovables, con un 40% de la inversión, eficiencia energética, con un 29%, 18% destinado a reforzar las redes y un 12% para electrificación. Esto se prevé que tenga un impacto en el PIB que supone un incremento del 2,5% respecto a un escenario sin el PNIEC. Se mejorará también la previsión de crecimiento de empleo, con aproximadamente 500.000 empleos creados en el año 2030, y se van a evitar, a raíz de la reducción de contaminantes atmosféricos, más de 5.800 muertes prematuras. En el PNIEC, además, hemos reforzado medidas relacionadas con el acompañamiento en la transición energética desde un punto social y territorial, con medidas para un desarrollo de renovables compatibles con la biodiversidad, que fije beneficios socioeconómicos en el entorno rural y que fortalezca la transición justa y la lucha contra la pobreza energética. También es importante destacar que en el nuevo PNIEC incluimos como novedad un capítulo específico para los aspectos transversales en la transición ecológica, como son la perspectiva de género, la adaptación al cambio climático o elementos relacionados con la conservación del medio ambiente. Me gustaría también citar un avance reciente que también tiene una importancia notable, que es el acuerdo alcanzado recientemente por el Consejo de la Unión Europea sobre una propuesta para modificar el diseño del mercado de la electricidad en la Unión Europea. Este hito ha permitido a la presidencia española del Consejo dar inicio a las negociaciones con el Parlamento Europeo con el objetivo de llegar a un acuerdo final. Esta reforma tiene metas ambiciosas y busca transformar el mercado eléctrico de la Unión Europea, y entre sus objetivos clave encontramos reducir la dependencia de los precios de la electricidad a los precios volátiles de los combustibles fósiles, salvaguardar a los consumidores contra aumentos bruscos de precios, acelerar el despliegue de energías renovables y fortalecer la protección de los consumidores. Hoy nos trae aquí la presentación del reciente WEO 2023, que es una herramienta clave en esta senda de transición energética, que nos proporciona información muy relevante para orientar nuestras políticas y acciones. Este informe, como veremos, nos indica cómo la demanda de combustibles fósiles alcanzará previsiblemente su punto máximo antes de 2030, marcando un cambio significativo en nuestra trayectoria energética y vislumbrando el principio del fin de la era de los combustibles fósiles. Sin duda, el WEO pone de manifiesto que estamos ante una nueva economía de las energías renovables, resaltando la transformación fundamental que está experimentando el panorama energético global. Desde el Ministerio para Transición Ecológica y el Reto Demográfico invitamos a todos presentes a aprovechar esta oportunidad para reflexionar sobre las implicaciones del WEO 2023 en el contexto español y a nivel global. Este informe no solo nos ofrece un diagnóstico detallado de la situación actual, sino que también señala caminos para construir un futuro energético más sostenible y resiliente. Agradezco nuevamente la oportunidad de estar hoy aquí abriendo esta sesión, y estoy convencida de que las discusiones y reflexiones que surjan a partir de este informe van a contribuir significativamente a una toma de decisiones informada y a un avance hacia un futuro energético más sostenible para todos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here on behalf of the International Energy Agency. 16 years is a great tradition, so we are very happy to continue that. And I'm sure while you have a lovely breakfast in front of you, there will also be some food for thought in the presentation that the IEA gives today. So I will just try to move on to the slides. Could you bring up the slides, please? Thank you. So we are in 2023, which is almost the 50-year anniversary of the International Energy Agency. We were set up in 1974, following the first oil shock in 1973. And I'm sure you will agree that we can't help see some echoes of 1973 in today's situation. So for this year's World Energy Outlook, we wanted to take a step back and give, at the opening, a bit of a long-term perspective on the evolution of the global energy sector. So what you can see here is global primary energy demand. First thing to note is the decline in the share of oil since the first oil shock, but also the extremely substantial growth in global primary energy demand, almost 2/3 in the last 50 years. 80% of that growth has come from emerging market and developing economies. This picture is even more stark when we look at the growth of global oil demand. Global oil demand roughly doubled over the last 50 years, but was essentially flat, small growth in advanced economies over the last 50 years. And in 1973, globally, there were about 50 million cars on the road. Today, there are 1.3 billion cars on the road, and yet global oil demand only doubled. So this is just to highlight the importance of fuel economy standards that we've put in place since the global oil shock, substitution of oil out of other sectors, and then today, increasingly, electrification. If we look at the power generation mix, it has also shifted substantially, but perhaps the key trend has been the scale of growth. Global oil demand doubled. Global power generation grew by 6 times. Today, renewables make up about 30% of global power generation. That has grown 10 percentage points since 2010. So a substantial change in the mix as well as in the scale of global power generation. So looking at these trends, we see 3 big themes coming back, which we keep touching on in this year's World Energy Outlook. The first is the continuing importance of energy security, and alongside its continuing importance, the changing nature of energy security. And I will say a few words about that later on in the presentation. The second key theme that we see coming out of these trends is the fact that the energy mix has changed in the past, and in some cases it has changed faster than people think. And so we need also to consider the possibility of change in the future. And the third key theme is the different trajectories that we see between countries. I've showed it here on the screen, between advanced economies and emerging market and developing economies. And that is a theme that we keep coming back to in this year's Outlook. We highlight in this year's World Energy Outlook several structural forces that, in our view, are changing the nature of the global energy sector. The first one of these is the growth of clean energy technologies. So here we can see annual sales of electric vehicles. In 2020, about 1 out of every 25 cars sold globally was electric. Our numbers for the year up until October 2023 suggest that this year it will be 1 out of 5 cars sold globally will be electric. So we've gone from 2020, 1 out of 25, to 2023, 1 out of 5. We project that by 2030, electric vehicles will make up 50% of annual sales in the 3 major global car markets: European Union, China, and the United States. Solar PV is another example of this acceleration of clean energy trends. We wanted, with this year's World Energy Outlook, to convey a message that solar PV is not a niche industry anymore. It has become a very substantial global industry. So what we did was we looked at the balance sheets of all of the companies globally, listed on stock exchanges globally, and looked at their invested capital. How much capital they have invested on their balance sheet? And then we compared it with all of the listed car manufacturers. We know that automobile manufacturing is a huge industry globally. And we found that invested capital in solar PV manufacturers was 1/4 of invested capital of global car manufacturers. That is a very substantial industry already today. We project that by 2030, wind and solar PV generation will have overtaken coal and will combined become the largest source of global electricity generation. The second big structural force that we highlight in this year's World Energy Outlook is the changing nature of Chinese economic growth. The Chinese government is targeting what they have called high-quality development, which means a shift away from a more investment-intensive growth model towards one more dependent on domestic consumption. And this is critically important given the size of China in the global energy sector. Just a few indicators that Chinese economic growth is already changing. Working age population has peaked. China's cement production peaked in 2015, and China's steel production has either already peaked or is very close to the peak. So things are changing in China. Economic growth is slowing down, which is normal for a country that has become quite wealthy per capita, but it is also changing in terms of its structure. So what does this mean for the outlook of the three fossil fuels? Let me start again with China. You can't help it because it was so important in driving the trends that we saw in the last couple of decades. Let me put it this way. In the first 2 decades of the 21st century, China added 100 exajoules to its energy demand. Doesn't mean very much to you, maybe. In the first 5 decades of the 20th century, so from 1900 to 1950, global energy demand grew 50 exajoules. So in 2 decades, China added twice as much as the growth of global energy demand in the first 5 decades of the 20th century. So China's emergence into the global energy system was a critical factor driving all of these trends. In the last decade, China accounted for 2/3 of global oil demand, 1/3 of global natural gas demand, about 1/3 of the growth of global energy demand, and it was a major player in global coal markets. In our assessment in terms of coal, in the power generation sector, we project that in the next couple of years, with the slowing rate of electricity demand growth, continued very strong growth in clean energy generation sources, coal demand in China's power sector will peak and start to decline slowly. In the case of oil demand, last year, electric cars already accounted for 1/3 of sales in China. This year, with the latest data that we have, we're looking at about 40% of sales of new cars electric in China. So we project that China's oil demand will peak this decade and start to slowly decline. Natural gas demand in China will continue to grow until roughly 2040, but not at the same pace that we have seen in the past decade. If we look now at advanced economies, coal demand in advanced economies peaked several decades and has been in structural decline. We estimate that this decline will accelerate. The rate of retirements of coal-fired capacity in advanced economies will go from an average of about 20 gigawatts per year retired in the last decade to about 30 gigawatts per year retired in the coming decade. In the case of oil demand, let's not forget that oil demand in advanced economies peaked in 2005 and has been declining slowly since then. So oil demand is also in structural decline in advanced economies. In the case of natural gas, we project that in the coming decade, the growth of renewables in the power generation sector, notably in the United States, but also in the European Union, will start to displace natural gas from the power generation sector, and that will push natural gas demand in advanced economies also into a decline. Of course, the picture is quite different when we look at the rest of the world. In the case of coal demand in emerging market and developing economies outside of China, it will continue to grow. There are places like India with still very low per capita energy demand, still very rapid energy demand growth, where coal will continue to grow, but basically nobody can substitute for China. So even if it is growing in the rest of the developing world, it will decline at the global level. Similarly, in the case of oil demand continues to grow in our outlook, driven in particular by the growth of the vehicle stock in places like India, Southeast Asia. In the case of natural gas demand, the key driver for the global growth of natural gas demand in the coming decade is actually the Middle East. By the early 2030s, we project that under current policies, natural gas demand per capita in the Middle East will exceed that of the United States in per capita terms. So the Middle East becomes the center of global natural gas demand growth. But there's also growth in the rest of the emerging world, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, for domestic industrialization, fertilizer production, and so on. But the key message is that when we add up all of these different trends, and they are different by fuel, they are different by sector, they are different by region, we see a peak for each of these three fossil fuels coming within the next decade. Of course, that's very good news from a climate perspective, that's good news from a clean energy perspective, but it's by no means enough to meet our climate goals. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the size of the clean energy industry today. So if you look at global clean solar PV manufacturing capacity, this is the capacity to manufacture the PV panels. This grew about fivefold between 2015 and 2022. And we project that it is on track with the announced expansion plans of companies around the world to roughly double again by 2030. But when we look at current policies, when we look at market dynamics, we see capacity additions well below the global manufacturing capacity. So as of today, capacity utilization in solar PV manufacturing is about 40%, which is well below what you would expect in a mature industry with a capacity factor of manufacturing facilities of maybe 75%. And under current policies in terms of both expansion plans for manufacturing, but also on the demand side, capacity additions of solar PV plants, we would expect that underutilization to continue. And this could put financial pressure on manufacturers globally. There is, however, a potential to use more of this manufacturing capacity. So if we raised the utilization rate to something more normal for a mature industry, we could add as much as 800 gigawatts per year by 2030 globally. This would have substantial impacts on fuel use in the power sector and emissions. In our stated policy scenario, both coal and gas demand in power generation peak and start to decline by 2030. If we used more of this solar PV manufacturing capacity, then the decline could be accelerated. It could be accelerated so much that we would be looking at roughly a 30% emissions reduction from power generation globally by 2030. And the key message here is that we've taken solar PV as one example, but we see these trends across several different clean energy technologies with very substantial industrial plans to expand the manufacturing capacity, but demand actually lagging a little bit behind. So there's lots of potential to go faster. Turning now to another key theme of our outlook, which is the global gas market, and in particular the global LNG market. So this is the picture in 2010. The global LNG market was dominated by point-to-point contracts between sellers and buyers. The market was not very liquid, and you will notice the United States is totally absent. The United States was a net importer in 2010. This is the picture today. Substantial change. The United States has emerged as a very substantial net exporter. The European Union has emerged essentially in the course of 2022 as a major LNG importer. In 2022, LNG accounted for about 35% of the European Union's natural gas imports, which is roughly the same share as Russian pipeline gas in the years before the Russia-Ukraine war. And of course, we saw that 2022 was a very turbulent year in global gas markets. We had gas prices 10 times their historical averages. We had extremely strong competition for natural gas volumes in the global LNG market, and we saw some buyers priced out of the market. And of course, that created strong concerns around energy security in the global LNG market. In our assessment, these concerns are set to ease because there is a huge wave of projects under construction and set to come online in the next couple of years. There's about 250 BCM of LNG projects that are under construction and set to be commissioned essentially from 2025 onwards, with large wave of commissioning in 2025 and 2026 already. To put that in perspective, 250 BCM is a 45% increase on the global LNG market today. This is coming at a time when the outlook for demand for natural gas and natural gas imports is a bit uncertain. The historical major markets of South Korea and Japan are not going to take any more. Europe demand is essentially saturated. The outlook for the global natural gas demand, global LNG market, therefore hinges critically on demand trends for natural gas in the other emerging Asia countries, so Southeast Asia and so on, as well as China. And we project that there will be significant competition among sellers for demand in these markets. And this means that we project that there will be little space for Russia to increase its global exports of, for example, LNG, because it will be coming into a market that will already be very well supplied. And for this reason, we project that Russia's share in globally traded natural gas, which was 30% before the war, will roughly halve by 2030. Looking now at investment, we project that in 2023, the world is set to invest about $1 trillion in fossil fuel supply, so coal, oil, natural gas. And this trend has been broadly stable. There is, of course, a decrease when global oil prices fell from 2014 to roughly 2018, with a small uptick in recent years. So a question that we're often asked is, under current policies, are we under-investing in the supply of fossil fuels? Of course, this is under current policies. A few years ago, we would have answered this question, yes, that we needed to increase investment in fossil fuels under current policies to meet projected demand. But with the projected growth of clean energy that I have highlighted on previous slides, we now project that under current policies, there would be no need to increase investment in global fossil fuel supply from current levels today. And this is essentially because clean energy investment has grown very strongly. It's increased about 40% over the last 3 years since 2020. And by 2030, we project that global clean energy investment will grow to more than $2 trillion. Of course, this is very good news, but it's not enough to meet our climate objectives. If we were to meet the IEA's net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, we would need to increase clean energy investment to roughly $4.5 trillion by 2030. And global fossil fuel investment, while not decreasing to zero, would fall substantially from today's level and also from the levels projected to be required in the stated policy scenario. It doesn't fall to zero because we would still need investment in currently approved fields, but we would not need investment in new fields that have not yet been approved. Now, I want to turn back to this theme of energy security and highlight another dimension of energy security that the IEA has been focused on in recent years, which is the market for critical minerals. So these are inputs into clean energy technologies, which we have been focusing on a lot in recent years. Just to explain the graph that you can see on the screen, because it's a little bit complicated, on the horizontal axis you can see the degree of market concentration measured as the market share of the top 3 producer countries. On the vertical axis you can see the market size. Take note that it's on a log scale, so sorry to bring in a bit of mathematics, but essentially we're going from markets that are relatively small to markets that are much larger, like for oil and gas. So in 2022, this is the picture that we have. You will note that first thing to notice is that the market concentration for critical minerals is much higher than for oil and gas, and it has in fact increased in recent years. So for example, the market concentration for nickel, the share of the top 3 producer countries, has gone from about 45% to about 66%. The market share for cobalt has gone from about 75% to about 90%. And one thing that I want to highlight, which is very important in understanding this data, is that what we are showing here is the market for the refined product, not for the raw material. So the market for processed critical minerals. So the IEA has been raising some concerns about the degree of market concentration here, and we also track very carefully where it would go if current projects are implemented. And this is the picture that we see in 2030 if current projects are implemented. There is some degree of improvement, but still these markets would remain very concentrated. And this is essentially because the projects that have been announced for new refining capacity are largely taking place in existing producers. So to give you an example, 50% of the new projects for lithium refining take place in China. 90% of the new projects for nickel refining that have been announced or have reached final investment take place in Indonesia. So new projects largely coming up in existing producers. There is some degree of diversification. So the degree of market concentration for lithium falls from almost 100% to about 85%. For nickel, it comes down from 70% to about 65%. So we need to keep vigilance around these markets as we think about the policies for the energy transition. We need to look at diversifying supply, but critically also at action on the demand side to increase the resilience of these supply chains. So actions to promote substitution with alternative materials, to promote recycling, and to promote demand reduction through decreased material intensity of production. Coming up to my last couple of slides and turning back to the issue of climate change, as was mentioned previously, this year we have COP28, which is, in many people's view, including the IEA's, perhaps the most important COP since Paris. We will have the conclusion of the global stocktake at this COP, which was a mechanism agreed in the Paris Agreement to review progress, and also the launch of the process for developing the next round of nationally determined contributions, which countries have to submit in 2025. So a very important COP. And it comes, to be honest, with a bit of a concerning picture on the climate change front. What you can see here is historical warming against pre-industrial levels with an estimate for 2023. It's now almost certain that 2023 will be the hottest year on record. We saw some months in 2023 that were above 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial level. Of course, this doesn't mean that the 1.5 degrees target has been breached. We would need to see global average temperatures above 1.5 for a prolonged period of time, but nonetheless, it's very worrying that we saw September in some data sets above 1.5 degrees, October in some data sets above 1.5 degrees, and many other indicators of record-breaking changes in our climate. record low levels of ice in the Arctic, record low levels of ice in the Antarctic as well. Record high sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic, for example. Under current policies, we project that the temperature would continue to rise, even though we see global energy sector CO2 emissions peaking in the current decade. Of course, we all know that to stop temperature rise, we need to get emissions to net zero. The peak is not enough. So under current policies, we would be looking at about 2.4 degrees by 2100, which of course is way above the target set by the Paris Agreement. We set out in our net zero emissions pathway what it would take for the energy sector to contribute to a pathway that would see global warming kept below 1.5 degrees by 2100. And we've put forward for COP28, and with many thanks to the Spanish government and to Enerclub, we had a very successful conference here, multilateral conference one month ago, which put forward some important chairs' recommendations that I think will be considered by COP28. So what does the IEA see as the essential actions that we need to look at COP28 to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees? The first thing is we would need by 2030 to triple global installed renewable capacity from about 3,600 gigawatts today to almost 11,000 gigawatts by 2030. This might sound like a huge challenge. It is, of course. But to put this in perspective, to do this, we would need to maintain the growth rate of global capacity additions that we've seen over the last decade to 2030. In other words, the growth rate of global capacity additions seen over the last decade would be sufficient to triple renewables capacity by 2030. The major problem is in emerging market and developing economies where renewables are held back by high costs of capital, a lack of a supportive policy framework, and regulatory uncertainty. The second key pillar is to double the rate of global energy intensity improvement. Historically, this is improved by a bit more than 1% per year, maybe 1.3% per year. Last year, with the global energy shock, was a good year. Energy prices were high. So global energy intensity improved by about 2% per year. We would need to reach about 4% per year by 2030. Again, this might sound like a huge challenge, but if we break it down, we can see what kind of actions are necessary to get there. A big part of this comes from electrification. Electricity is much more efficient than incumbent fossil fuel technologies. An electric car is 3 times more efficient than an internal combustion engine vehicle. A heat pump is as much as 5 times more efficient than a gas boiler. So a lot of this intensity improvement comes just through electrification. Of course, we need other measures as well. We need to reduce the material intensity of production. Behavioral change can also play a role in countries that are willing to support policies that promote behavioral change. And of course, we need improvements in the technical efficiency of the industrial motors, the air conditioners, the internal combustion engine vehicles that are still sold out to 2030. But basically, when we break it down, this doubling doesn't look as daunting as it might initially seem. If we do these two measures, and if we scale up investment in clean energy technology sufficiently, then global fossil fuel demand would fall by 2030 by about 25%, and that would lead to about a 35% reduction in global energy sector emissions by 2030. And it's very important to highlight that while we see a role for carbon capture and storage in a net zero pathway, it has a critical role to play in certain sectors and for certain uses. In our view, it's extremely clear if we want to reduce emissions from fossil fuel, we need to reduce demand for fossil fuel. The other critical action is to reduce emissions of methane from global fossil fuel operations. If we don't do this, there's absolutely no chance that we can keep warming below 1.5 degrees, because methane is such a powerful, short-lived greenhouse gas. We did an analysis of what it would take to keep warming below 1.5 degrees if the global fossil fuel industry doesn't reduce the methane intensity of its production. Okay, methane emissions would fall because demand falls a little bit, but if there's no action on the supply side to reduce intensity of production, we analyzed what it would take to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. And essentially the highlight is that global energy sector CO2 emissions would need to reach net zero by 2045 instead of 2050. That might not sound like much, but for any company, any country who has considered the really rapid rate of change that is required to get to net zero by 2050, 5 less years is very significant. So a key message for us is methane reductions is absolutely critical to any equitable pathway to keeping warming below 1.5 degrees. And just to remind everyone again, this 75% reduction of methane is far greater than the decline in the demand for fossil fuels because in our pathway we reduce the methane intensity of production. And finally, we've called for substantial efforts to scale up clean energy investment in emerging market and developing economies outside of China. Why do we say outside of China? The reason is that essentially if you look at global clean energy investment in advanced economies and China, these two regions have accounted for about 95% of the growth in clean energy investment since the signature of the Paris Agreement in 2015. Another way of putting it is that in real terms, clean energy investment in emerging market and developing economies has been essentially stagnant outside of China. So we need to reverse this trend if we are to have a chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And this requires collaboration. We need stronger policies in these countries, more stable regulatory environments to develop the project pipelines, but we also need more low-cost capital to finance these projects at affordable rates in these economies. So with that, I'll stop there. I hope it was an interesting presentation and I look forward to any questions. Arcadio, I don't know if you want me to stay up here or...
Thank you very much. First of all, congratulations for the 50th birthday of the International Energy Agency. And now I think this World Energy Outlook is very holistic, in all this area, and they have some controversial issues here, for the forecast of the future. Maybe now is the time for a conversation. If you would like to ask something, there are some people here. You introduce yourself and ask Thomas whatever you want. No? Okay. First of all, this guy. There are 3 or 4. Okay.
Yes, Carlos Soler from KPMG. Thank you so much, Mr. Spencer, for your presentation. How do you see the storage industry and the activity as a key lever to face with so ambitious plan for renewables?
We do several or one by one?
Another one here. I have the same question. The same question. Another one here.
Hello, Angel Bautista from Repsol. So we are a medium-sized IOC. So seeing my personal, first of all, congratulations. Was a really, really clear and really wonderful presentation. When I look at your oil demand, and we're investing a lot in no carbon, but we have our legacy oil demand. My personal opinion is we will be somewhere in between net zero and SEPs, probably. That's my personal opinion, but I don't have a crystal ball. But in that scenario, I see in the SEPs scenario that oil demand really doesn't fall so much, and then you must add there all renewable liquid fuels. So you see like liquid fuels having more or less a stable demand until 2050. But then you have the share of IOCs being reduced and reduced and reduced. We're just 15% of oil production right now. So what does that mean in terms of geopolitics? OPEC gets more power, and the United States gets more power. In terms of prices, if we don't invest, so does it really fit that we don't see growing prices in the oil market with this strong demand still, and having OPEC in English, sorry, having more and more market share in the future?
Maybe you can answer this.
Let's take one more. So I can remember 3 questions, not 4. 4 is it?
I'll try to make it very simple so you remember this one. Thanks a lot for the presentation. It was really great. My question is on hydrogen. Okay, you didn't mention it much. How do you see the role of hydrogen, and in particular, the role of hydrogen in transportation, since it's part of the transportation is difficult to decarbonize?
Yes. So first of all, on the question of storage, storage will obviously have a critical role to play in integrating variable renewables, and we are seeing a very strong uptick in capacity additions for storage in several markets around the world. In California, it's quite well known. In Australia, it's quite well known. But also in China, we're seeing a big uptick in capacity additions for storage just this year, including, incidentally, not just battery storage, but also pumped hydro. There's been very big investments in pumped hydro in China this year. It's so important that I think we will take a deep dive into it next year. So I will invite you to take a look at what we do next year. But essentially, also with the growth of solar PV, we essentially see the need for storage increasing. So it's also being pushed on the supply side that markets with more and more solar PV will require more storage because the complementarity is very strong. So we would expect that the strong outlook for solar PV that we have highlighted is going to create a very strong outlook for storage. There's also some interesting technology innovations that we are seeing. You know, we've seen Northvolt announce that it has commercialized sodium-ion batteries, which can be lower cost than lithium-ion, maybe interesting for stationary storage. So there's a lot going on in the sector, and we feel that we don't yet have a full picture of the data to see the outlook, but we will be taking a look at this for sure. Yes, so on the second question regarding the outlook for oil demand, so it was very interesting. If you look at the launch that Dr. Birol did of the World Energy Outlook last month, so many of the questions were related to the outlook for oil demand, and so many were contrasting our outlook with that of other forecasters, including OPEC. So I think there are still some questions in people's mind about the outlook for demand under current policies. In our outlook, of course, in the way that our model runs, the projection for prices is because we can't model, stochastic uncertainties like geopolitics and so on. But yes, oil prices are fairly stable under current policies. They don't rise to very high levels. I think in terms of market concentration, this is highest in our scenarios with the lowest demand. So in the net zero scenario, the market share for OPEC increases to more than 50% by 2050, which is higher than its highest ever share. It's higher than the share of OPEC during the first oil shock. And this is essentially because they're very low-cost producers, and the very low level of demand pushes world prices down to the marginal cost of production. So in our current policies scenario, because demand is a bit high and relatively stable, there's space for higher cost producers, and the degree of market concentration is not so high. We published yesterday, and I invite you to take a look at it, a special report on the outlook for the oil and gas sector in the context of energy transitions. And in that report, we highlighted that there may be other production mixes that we could look at. A lot of producers say we should be the marginal producer for the reason that we have the lowest cost production, or we should be the marginal producer for the reason that we are a domestic producer and we provide energy security, or we should be the marginal producer because we have the lowest CO2 intensity, the lowest GHG intensity of production. Or for producers in Africa, we should be the marginal producer because we're not a producer historically and we should have our chance at development. The point that we made in the report that was published yesterday is that any of those logics would lead to different impacts on the oil market. It would have an impact on price if we don't. And in the context of a global market, it's hard to see a coordination mechanism other than price, right? And so the level of demand is the critical determinant for the level of the price. Regarding the question on the outlook for hydrogen, so again, I would differentiate this a little bit by scenario. In our net zero scenario, there's of course strong growth in global demand for hydrogen as it is used to substitute fossil fuels in sectors such as long-distance shipping, in heavy industry, and so on. But broadly speaking, if you look at the first net zero report that we published in 2021, and you look at the update that we published in 2023, we have somewhat downgraded our projections for hydrogen. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, in the 2021 net zero report, the ramp up to 2030 was very steep. And so when we look at the current project pipeline, which we track very closely, it was pretty clear that getting to that 2030 level with the current project pipeline, with typical lead time for new projects and so on, would be very challenging. The second reason that we slightly downgraded our outlook is that we see more technology progress and more market momentum behind alternative solutions. So, for example, we track the investment plans and the corporate strategies of original equipment manufacturers in the automobile sector, including the trucking sector. And our assessment was that they were placing bigger bets on battery electric vehicles for part of the trucking market and so on. So if you look at the projection for the transport energy mix in our net zero scenario, compared to the 2021 version, the 2023 version is more electrified. The third element that we highlighted is the risk of demand and supply imbalance. So if you look at the project pipeline for electrolyzer manufacturing, for example, it's very promising. It would get us quite close to the levels of electrolyzer manufacturing. Indeed, we're going to release a report today that suggests that the latest announcements could get us to the level of electrolyzer manufacturing that we would need in the net zero scenario by 2030. But when we look on the demand side, we don't see so much momentum. So if you look at projects for green hydrogen-based steel production, projects for green hydrogen-based synthetic aviation fuel production, it doesn't equate to as much supply as we see. And this is also what I was mentioning in the solar PV panel slide that I showed. We see a lot of momentum on the supply and some concerns about the robustness of the demand signals. And that is also a message that we have been highlighting to policymakers.
Some more questions? There are another one here, some more people here, another one there. Mike there, another one there.
Javier Rodriguez from the Spanish SPA Association. Thanks and congratulations. And my question has to do with energy-intensive industries. In many occasions, investments related with industry are correlated and follow up energy investments. Coming into this, what kind of trends do you foresee regarding energy-intensive industries and how to avoid the risk of carbon leakage?
Yeah. Hello, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Spencer and the agency for the opportunity, and the club for the opportunity to be here. My question is related with nuclear. Very controversial in Europe and in Spain and in all over the world. What is the position? No more than the position, the information that you can give us to the future.
Hi, this is Iñaki de las Heras from Spanish newspaper La Vanguardia. I've got two concrete questions about Spain. I missed some information about Spain. The first of them is about the draft of the plan of energy to 2030. It fixed 21% of renewable energy for the end of this period. I would like to know this is a realistic goal for your agency. And also this draft fixed a 22 gigawatt storage capacity for a period. Do you think this is enough to replace the nuclear and the gas backup in Spain?
Intensive industries, nuclear.
I think the second round was more difficult. What's the third round going to be like? So on the question for energy-intensive industries, I think the first theme that we would highlight is divergent investment trends by region. I think this is not surprising for anybody. Not so optimistic in Europe. A lot of investment taking place in China. Also part of the drive to localize production in China to substitute for imports. So one data point that we highlighted in this year's World Energy Outlook, which I find really quite mind-blowing, is that between 2019 and 2023, China is set to add the equivalent petrochemical production capacity of the advanced economies in Asia and Europe combined, essentially to substitute for imports of plastics and petrochemical products. So quite divergent trend there. And then, of course, quite strong in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act. We have seen huge increase in investment in industrial projects. Of course, this raises some questions about the level playing field. The IEA has highlighted, the importance of a level playing field in heavy industry for many years. We've worked on issues of carbon leakage for many years. I think we are in a more complex landscape here because we are not just talking about differentials in carbon pricing, we're also talking about differentials in promotional schemes between regions. And so, the risk that carbon leakage occurs not just because there's a difference in the carbon price, but also because there is a difference in subsidy schemes. And of course, the Inflation Reduction Act has been highlighted a lot publicly, but we should not forget there are others who have been doing similar things for quite some time.
Do you have data, the establishment of these?
That is a really great question. So, and one of the reasons that I think the context is more difficult is because in a way there is, trade economists like to talk about disciplines. What are the rules that are in the game, and transparency. And in these schemes, there is maybe less transparency than there is in an explicit carbon pricing scheme. So I think there is a huge role for international organizations to start collecting more data on the policies that are promoting the installation of new manufacturing facilities and so on. And I hope that it's something that the IEA will continue to strengthen. We have, in the last couple of years, really expanded our work on gathering data on the manufacturing pipeline. I think the next step for us is to start looking at some of the economic aspects of that. So keep an eye on that space. On the question on nuclear, so our overall perspective is that in part because of the energy crisis last year, the outlook for nuclear has brightened a bit globally. We see new policy announcements in places like Japan, in places like Korea, but also other countries aiming to support either lifetime extensions or new capacity additions of nuclear power. We also, have looked at the innovation that is taking place in alternative reactor designs, small modular reactors, and so on. It's still a very dynamic space. You will have seen that one of the major projects in the United States has been cancelled and hasn't been very good for the share price of the company that was involved in that. So SMRs are still a very dynamic space. I don't think it's It's a bit too early to say what the impact would be in the longer term, but certainly we would be looking at something post 2035. If you look at the way that we see nuclear even in a strong decarbonization scenario, so in our net zero emissions scenario, we deploy nuclear quite strongly in those countries that have expressed a willingness to use it. And we explicitly make that choice in the modeling. We don't use it in our model in countries that have not got a social and political consensus that they will use it. And so in our net zero scenario, the installed capacity of nuclear roughly doubles from today's level by 2050, but the share of nuclear generation is basically stable. And this is because electricity demand grows so strongly in that scenario. And we see this even in China. You know, China has, I think it's fair to say, the most ambitious nuclear program in the world, the largest program of reactor construction. Nuclear power generation is 5% of the electricity mix in China and has been overtaken and substantially exceeded by solar PV and wind, which account for about 10% of China's electricity production today. And it's just the speed that you can deploy solar PV and wind because it is modular. That means that even in a country like China with such an ambitious program, it has been overtaken. So we at the agency think that nuclear is a very important part of a low emissions mix. It also provides dispatchable capacity, which is very important to balance the system. But we see that even with a very strong push on nuclear in countries that are politically and socially willing to use it in our net zero scenario, its share in the electricity generation mix still stays roughly the same compared to what it is today. And then regarding the question from Spain, I'm very sorry, but I'm going to have to defer on that question. Maybe you can ask, Lucía. But, you know, at the International Energy Agency, unless we have a recent report on a country that dives in a lot of detail into these issues, we try not to comment on individual country policies.
Some more questions. I would like to ask you another one. You said that the overproduction in solar panels, all this kind of thing, you show us this small reduction in the production on the critical materials. At the end of the day, what will forecast for the European industry in the future? No? And this new critical industrial act, all these things we are seeing right now.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously this is a very dynamic space. So we are seeing announcements for new mining projects, for new refining projects, almost every day. Last year we saw a 30% increase in investment in new critical mineral mining production. So it is a very dynamic space. The numbers that we showed on that slide, of course, are not the last word because it is changing very, very rapidly. But the fact is that if we look at, as of today, with the data that we have, what has been currently announced in terms of new mining and new refining projects, we see some reduction in the market concentration, but it's quite small. And that implies that regions that are net importers of the refined product today would remain net importers going forward. And this is also why we have highlighted that action on the demand side is so important. The recycling, material substitution, and material demand reduction on the demand side is an action that net importers can take to increase their resilience. But yeah, it's something that we are watching extremely closely. You might have noticed that in April, we released for the first time critical minerals market outlook. Which, you know, normally we have done this for many years for natural gas, for oil, coal. We do a market outlook either monthly for oil or bi-yearly for natural.
This new report for oil, this concentration in the NOC and NOC companies, it is 3% or something of the market in the near future.
Yeah. So we will continue to do this market monitoring role for critical minerals. And in fact, it's something that our member governments have explicitly requested that we strengthen our market monitoring. So you could see a market report from us either annually or biannually going forward on critical minerals.
Okay. Any question more? Another one over there. Let's give them the mic there.
Hi, this
Last
is
one.
Andrea Real from Acción Energía. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I was wondering if you've given any thought to what might happen in terms of curtailments, especially considering the huge penetration of solar PV and the fact that regulation in terms of storage is not really all there in most countries. Thank you.
I think one here.
Thank you. Thank you for the very. Yes. My name is Francisco Castejon. I am from the Nuclear Safety Council. Okay. We take care of safety, not on policies. Okay. Now my question is about the possible emergency of new technologies. I mean, you perform your predictions in the state of the art of the technologies we are having today, but do you keep any space, any role of new technologies? For instance, I used to be a fusion researcher. I see that fusion maybe will play some role after, unfortunately, 2050. But apart from fusion, there are other technologies that could appear in the scenario. Do you take this into account?
Okay, thanks for those two questions. So regarding curtailment, of course, it's something that we look at very closely in our electricity market report that we produce every year. We've looked at levels of curtailment across different electricity markets. Our basic assessment at the global level is that for today, curtailment levels are within reasonable limits. For example, in China, they were as much as 15% in 5 years ago, but it has come down quite significantly with the construction of new transmission lines. But we all know that it's like running ahead of a bus that is accelerating as well. The more renewables we have, the more flexibility we will need in electricity markets. And the more technologies we will need to integrate variable renewables. So it's something that we're watching quite closely. I think if you look at European markets, last year, this year, we already see quite some negative or very low prices in high solar periods. With the amount of capacity additions that we see next year, I think will be similar, if not worse. So it's something that we really need to keep an eye on and keep investing in both the market reforms that can help to integrate variable renewables, but also the technologies. And here, of course, storage, but also demand response will have a critical role to play. I think it's also something, incidentally, for the solar manufacturing industry to take a look at. I mean, if the manufacturing industry is making plans to build 1,000 gigawatts of production capacity per year by 2030, what does that mean for capacity installations and then generation during high solar hours in their main markets? Because it is a constraint on the rate of capacity growth. And then regarding the question on technologies, so we actually monitor energy technologies very closely. We have an annual publication called the Clean Energy Technology Guide, which is a downloadable database of about 550 clean energy technologies across all the sectors. So you can download the Excel file, and we, in that database, we describe the technologies, but we also assign a score to them on the scale of technology readiness. So this is quite well established scale in innovation, research and innovation policy. And essentially, in our modeling, we don't assume the deployment of any technologies that are below prototype or demonstration phase today. So for example, we don't model nuclear fusion in our scenarios or other similarly technologies that are below prototype stage today. But certainly that's a database that we update every year. It's something that we keep an eye on very closely.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the outstanding presentation, for the answer. Congratulations once again. Applause for him. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Please.